February 14, 1933, Bumpy Johnson was outnumbered 12-1. Dutch Schultz had sent his deadliest crew, Tommy the Executioner, Vento Marty, Isaapic, Delaney, 10 more killers, whose names even the police didn't know. They cornered Bumpy in the Cotton Club basement. No witnesses, no way out. Bumpy was 27 years old, still learning the game. Dutch Schultz was the most powerful mobster in New York. Everyone expected the same ending, Bumpy Johnson dead in a basement. But what Dutch didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson didn't play by anybody's rules. 90 minutes later, only one of those 12 men walked out alive. And he delivered a message that made Dutch Schultz, the man who had killed over 40 people, go pale. This is the true story of the night Bumpy Johnson became untouchable. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Harlem in 1933. You need to understand the desperation, the economics, the power structures that had formed in this neighborhood during one of America's darkest decades. This wasn't the Harlem Renaissance anymore. That era of jazz, art, and cultural flourishing had been beautiful while it lasted, but it was already fading by the time the stock market crashed in 1929. The Depression hit Harlem harder than most places. Unemployment among Black New Yorkers reached over 60%. Families that had been stable were suddenly facing impossible choices. Businesses that had thrived for years closed their doors forever. Young people who should have been in school were instead on the streets, desperate, searching for any way to survive. The promise that had drawn so many to Harlem seemed to evaporate overnight, replaced by a suffocating sense of hopelessness that gripped the entire neighborhood. And when people are desperate, when they have nothing left to lose, when their children are hungry and their landlords are demanding rent they don't have, they gamble. Not because they believe in luck, but because hope, however slim, is all they have left. The numbers racket, illegal lottery. This was the lifeblood of Harlem during those years. The financial heartbeat that kept the neighborhood functioning when legitimate work had dried up. You could walk into any barbershop on 125th Street and place a bet. You could visit any bodega, any street corner, any pool hall. The barrier to entry was almost non-existent. A nickel, sometimes a dime, maybe a quarter if you were feeling bold. The odds seemed reasonable, the potential rewards astronomical. If your 3 numbers came in, you won $50. For someone making $5 to $7 a week working the hardest job they could find, that $50 represented nearly a week's entire wages. For a desperate family, it represented hope. It represented the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. The beauty of the numbers game was that it worked through mathematics, pure, simple mathematics that couldn't be cheated or manipulated. The drawings were based on publicly available information, Federal Reserve figures, stock market data, horse racing results, numbers that appeared in the newspapers every single day. Nobody could rig it. That's what made it different from the other games. The ones run by white criminals in downtown speakeasies, where the odds were designed to ensure the house always won. In Harlem's numbers game, there was at least a theoretically fair chance. That legitimacy, that sense of fairness, was what made people trust it. That's what made them keep playing. By the early 1930s, millions of dollars were flowing through the numbers game every single year. Millions. Every numbers runner in Harlem was collecting bets from dozens of locations throughout the neighborhood. Every policy housed the operations centers where bets were collected and tallied was taking in tens of thousands of dollars weekly, sometimes hundreds of thousands. The money was unimaginable. Stacks of cash so large they required teams of people just to count them. And that money had to be controlled by someone. It had to be protected, it had to be organized. And that someone, that person with the power to organize millions of dollars flowing through the poorest neighborhoods in America, held more real power than any city official, any police captain, any legitimate businessman in New York. Before Bumpy Johnson became the king of Harlem, there was a queen, Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as Madame St. Clair, was a Caribbean immigrant from Guadeloupe. She had arrived in New York in the early 1920s with nothing but determination and intelligence. She came from nothing, and she built an empire from nothing. She started by collecting bets herself, walking the streets of Harlem in her early years, learning the business from the ground up, understanding every aspect of how money moved through her community. She understood the economics of desperation. She understood the mathematics of probability. She understood people. By the early 30s, Madame St. Clair was one of the most powerful figures in Harlem. She controlled the numbers racket on the east side of Manhattan, She had runners throughout the neighborhood, reliable men and women who understood the importance of their work. She had connections with the police, the right kind of connections. The kind that came from understanding that law enforcement was just another business, and you negotiated with other businesses. But, more importantly, she had respect. Deep, genuine respect that came from how she treated people. Respect was currency in Harlem, more valuable than money sometimes. Respect meant protection. Respect meant that your business would operate without interference. Respect meant that when problems arose, when disputes threatened to tear the community apart, people would listen to you. Respect meant that you could walk through the neighborhood and know that people had your back. Respect meant that your family was safe. And Madame St. Clair had earned respect through intelligence, strategy, and an unwavering loyalty to her community. She understood something fundamental about power that many powerful men never grasp. She understood that you couldn't just extract wealth from a community and disappear. You had to give something back. When numbers runners got robbed, Madame St. Clair made sure they got their money back. When disputes erupted between runners, she settled them fairly, with wisdom and understanding of the circumstances. When people in her organization fell on hard times, she made sure they were taken care of. When the police became too aggressive, she had the connections and the political capital to push back. She understood that in Harlem, power flowed in both directions. You took, but you also gave. You demanded respect, but you also showed respect. You built loyalty, not through fear, but through genuine investment in the people who worked for you. Her enforcer during these years was a young man named Ellsworth Johnson, called Bumpy because of a large distinctive bump on his forehead from a childhood fight that had left a permanent mark. Bumpy was different from other muscle in the organized crime world. He wasn't just a trigger man. He wasn't just a man who solved problems with violence and intimidation. Bumpy was smart, remarkably smart. He had educated himself in prison, spending years reading Shakespeare, philosophy, history, literature. He had spent more time with books than with people during his incarceration, and those books had shaped how he understood the world. He understood power in a way that most men, even most men in the criminal world, never did. He understood that fear was temporary. Today, you feared a man, but tomorrow, someone else would come along who was even more frightening, and your fear would shift to them. But respect was permanent. Respect endured. When you ruled through fear, you were always vulnerable, always watching over your shoulder, always waiting for the next challenge, the next young hungry man who wanted to take your place. But when you ruled through respect, when men followed you not because they were terrified of you, but because they believed in you, because they understood that you would protect them and take care of them, then you were untouchable. Then you could rest easy knowing that your position was secure, not because of your gun, but because of your character. Bumpy had been fighting since he was 10 years old. Street fights in Charleston, South Carolina, where he had grown up. Prison riots after he was arrested and locked away. Wars over territory in Harlem as the criminal underworld expanded and redefined itself. He had learned something that most men never learned. Something that couldn't be taught in any school or read in any book. Violence has a rhythm. It has patterns. It has psychology. It has rules. Unwritten but fundamental rules that govern how violence unfolds. And if you understood those rules, if you could read that rhythm like a musician reads sheet music, if you could anticipate the patterns before they emerged, you could survive against odds that should have killed you. Bumpy understood those rules in his bones. Dutch Schultz was not a man who understood those rules. He understood power the way he understood bootlegging. You took what you wanted, you eliminated the competition, and you kept taking until someone stopped you. Simple, direct, effective, at least until it wasn't. Dutch Schultz was German-Jewish, born in the Bronx, raised in poverty like so many immigrants in New York. During Prohibition, he had made millions of dollars. He ran speakeasies throughout the city. He controlled distribution networks for illegal alcohol. He had connections with corrupt politicians and police officers. He had built an empire through violence, intimidation, and cunning. By 1933, Prohibition was ending. The government had finally admitted what everyone already knew: the war on alcohol was unwinnable. The money from bootlegging was drying up. Dutch needed a new empire. He needed a new source of wealth. He looked south toward Harlem. He saw the millions of dollars flowing through the numbers game every single week. And he decided he wanted it. All of it. Dutch Schultz sent emissaries to Harlem in January 1933. These weren't just any men. They were dangerous men, men with reputations that preceded them through every speakeasy and criminal den in New York. Men who had worked for Dutch in his bootlegging operation, men who had proven they could kill without hesitation or remorse. They sat down with Madame St. Clair at her club on 133rd Street, a place that had become legendary as a neutral ground where business was conducted and disputes were resolved. The message they delivered was simple and direct, the way Dutch Schultz liked his messages. Work with Dutch, pay him tribute, acknowledge his power, or get buried. Dutch didn't make elaborate threats. He didn't need to. His reputation preceded him like a cold wind. He had killed over 40 people with his own hands. The emissaries delivered their message with the confidence of men who had never been told no, and they waited for her response. Madame St. Clair, a woman in her 50s who had built her empire from nothing, who had survived as a female immigrant in a brutal city during brutal times, who had navigated the treacherous politics of Harlem's underworld with intelligence and grace, looked at these white men sitting in her club and said one word: "Get out." The emissaries looked at each other. They looked around the club as if searching for support, for backup, for anything that might change the situation. They saw Bumpy standing in the corner, leaning against the wall with the kind of stillness that only comes from absolute confidence. He was watching them with an expression that revealed nothing. His face was blank, empty, like a man made of stone. One of the emissaries, perhaps the boldest or perhaps the most foolish, turned to Bumpy. "You want to be smart about this, boy?" Bumpy didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. That stare, the one that had made men throughout Harlem check their life insurance policies and wonder if they would see tomorrow morning, made them wonder if their families would ever find out what happened to them. The stare of someone who had already accepted death and therefore had nothing left to fear, nothing left to lose. The emissaries left. They reported back to Dutch Schultz at his headquarters in the Bronx. And Dutch, who had never been told no by anyone, who had certainly never been told no by a black woman and her enforcer, who had built his entire empire on the principle that his will superseded everyone else's, made a decision that would echo through Harlem for decades. Burn it all down, starting with him, starting with Bumpy. He didn't just want Bumpy dead. That would be too easy. That would be insufficient. That would send the wrong message. He wanted it to be a message, public, brutal, the kind of death that makes everyone else fall in line, the kind of death that demonstrates absolute power and absolute consequences, the kind of death that ends negotiations forever and establishes dominance so complete that no one would ever challenge it again. Bumpy got a tip. The intelligence came from one of his sources, someone deep inside Dutch Schultz's organization, someone with access to plans and movements. The information was specific and urgent. Dutch's men were planning to hit Madame St. Clair's main counting house on Lenox Avenue at dawn. This was the facility where all the money from the numbers game in that district was collected and tallied. It was headquartered. It was the nerve center of her operation. If Dutch could take it, he would gain leverage. He would have proof that he could strike at will, that his reach extended into Harlem whenever he chose. Bumpy went to check it out. Whether he went alone or whether he already knew what he was walking into, whether this was a trap that he had set himself or a trap that he was deliberately walking into for reasons only he understood. History gets fuzzy here. The historical record becomes unclear, fragmented by time and the reluctance of those involved to speak openly about what really happened. But what we know with certainty is where he went. The Cotton Club basement, not the famous Cotton Club downtown. That was a different place entirely, a venue that catered exclusively to white audiences. The place where white New Yorkers came to hear black jazz, played by black musicians, but never actually sat near them, never shared the same space with them in any meaningful way. This was the real Cotton Club, the after-hours spot in the heart of Harlem, the place where the real players came, where serious money was gambled, where disputes were settled, where a man's word meant everything and broken promises meant death. The basement was storage, crates of liquor stacked along the walls, creating shadows within shadows, poker tables where thousands of dollars changed hands every night, and a single exit, a narrow staircase leading up to the street. It was a perfect place for a trap, dark, enclosed, only one way out. No windows, no other exits. Anyone trapped down there would have to fight their way up those stairs or die in the darkness. Dutch Schultz's men arrived early, hours before sunrise. They came in shifts so as not to draw attention. Tommy the executioner arrived first, his reputation preceding him. He had killed 16 men, always close range, always made sure his victims saw his face before the darkness took them. That was his signature. The last thing his victims saw was Tommy's face, and perhaps in that final moment, they understood what it meant to be judged and found wanting. Vento came next, followed by Marty, Isipik, and Delaney. 10 more men whose names were never recorded, whose existence seemed to exist solely for the purpose of ending other lives. They positioned themselves throughout the basement, in the shadows behind crates, behind poker tables, behind barrels of liquor. They waited in the darkness with guns loaded and ready. They were professionals. They had done this before. They had trained for this. 12 men, 12 guns, 12 killers waiting for one man to descend into their trap. 4:32 in the morning, Bumpy descended those stairs. Alone or not, he descended into darkness. The room was barely lit, just one light bulb swinging from the ceiling, throwing shadows that seemed to move and shift with a life of their own. The air smelled of dust, liquor, and something else. Something that soldiers and killers recognize. The smell of imminent violence, and then he heard it. The sound that changes everything. The sound that separates the living from the sun-to-be-dead. The sound of safeties clicking off 12 guns, 12 men stepping out of the shadows simultaneously, revealing themselves in a choreographed movement that spoke of planning and preparation. The light caught their faces, shadows, and angles, creating a nightmare tableau. Tommy the executioner stepped forward, his gun raised and ready. His face showed confidence, the absolute certainty of a man who had never lost an encounter, who had never faced anyone he couldn't kill. He smiled. "Dutch sends his regards," he said. Bumpy stood there, hands at his sides, face calm, completely composed. He looked around the room slowly, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. He finished his count and looked back at Tommy. That all he sent. Tommy's smile faded. His confidence wavered for just a moment. See, that's the thing about Bumpy Johnson that people didn't understand. He didn't posture, didn't bluff, didn't play games or try to seem tougher than he was. If he said something, he meant it. His words carried weight because his actions always backed them up. And standing there outnumbered 12 to 1, outnumbered by 12 professional killers, asking if that was all they sent, that wasn't bravado. That wasn't the desperate last words of a dying man trying to seem brave. That was calculation. That was the question of a man who had thought through the situation and found something that made him confident, that made him dangerous. "You got about 5 seconds to beg," Tommy said, raising his gun. The tone of his voice had changed. There was an edge to it now, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Every gun in the basement stayed trained on Bumpy. 12 barrels, 12 fingers on triggers, 12 men waiting for the order to fire. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. "You're making a mistake." "What mistake?" Tommy's voice carried the confidence of a man who had survived dozens of situations exactly like this, who had killed his way through every problem that ever confronted him. "You're about to be dead. The mistake," Bumpy said slowly, "is thinking I came here alone." Now, here's where things get interesting. 12 guns stayed trained on him, but something changed. Something fundamental shifted in the basement. There was hesitation, doubt, a crack in the wall of certainty that Tommy and his men had built. Tommy glanced at the stairs. Nothing. No sound, no movement. He looked back at Bumpy. "You're bluffing." Bumpy smiled for the first time. "Then shoot." Nobody shot. And here's what Dutch Schultz'S men didn't know. Bumpy Johnson had been fighting since he was 10 years old. He had learned something that most men never learned in their entire lives. Violence has a rhythm. It has patterns. It has weak points. And right now, standing in that basement, Bumpy controlled the rhythm. He had shifted something fundamental in the dynamic of the moment. He had introduced doubt. And doubt, in a moment of violence, when men are armed and trained to kill, is often more dangerous than the violence itself. Doubt makes men hesitate. Hesitation makes men miss. Miss makes men die. Tommy's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance. Bumpy moved. What happened next is where the historical record gets murky. The one survivor's testimony was confused, fragmented, contradictory. Some details didn't match. But here's what we know with certainty. Bumpy didn't go for a gun. He went for the light. One punch. An explosive burst of movement that sent his fist up toward the hanging bulb. The hanging bulb shattered. Complete darkness. All 12 men in the basement were suddenly blind, plunged into absolute blackness where they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. And then, chaos. Complete and total chaos. The first shots came wild and panicked. Men shooting at shadows, shooting at sounds, shooting at movement that was only in their minds. Tommy screaming, "Hold your fire, hold your fire." But fear doesn't listen to orders. Fear is primal. It overrides everything. It overrides training and discipline and rational thought. In that darkness, in that moment of terror and confusion, Bumpy became something else. A ghost, a phantom. He knew that room. He had played poker there 100 times. He knew every crate, every table, every corner, every shadow, every sound that echoed through that space. Dutch Schultz'S men didn't. They had never been there before. They were fighting blind, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, fighting in a place they didn't know, and the advantage of that difference was absolute. What happened in the next 3 minutes happened in darkness. What happened was violence, chaos, terror, organized violence executed by a master. One by one, you could hear them going down. Not all from gunshots. Bumpy didn't waste bullets. Bullets were loud. Bullets attracted attention. Bullets could miss. So he used his hands. He used their confusion. He used the fact that they were shooting each other in the panic, their bullets finding flesh, instead of the ghost moving through the darkness. A scream, a body hitting the floor, another gunshot, another scream. Tommy tried to rally them. The stairs, get to the stairs, regroup upstairs. But Bumpy was already there. He had moved through that darkness like he owned it, because in that moment, he did own it. He owned the space. He owned the rhythm of violence. He owned their fear. 3 minutes. That's how long the violence lasted. 3 minutes of absolute hell. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours to everyone in that basement. 3 minutes where the rules of the civilized world didn't apply, where the only law was the law of the strongest, the fastest, the most willing to do what needed to be done, and then silence, complete silence. The kind of silence that follows violence, thick and heavy with the weight of what has just transpired. When someone finally opened the basement door from upstairs and let light spill down those steps, here's what they found. 11 bodies, not all dead, but all down, broken bones, gunshot wounds, many from friendly fire, from bullets fired in panic at shadows and sounds, men unconscious, their faces bloodied and broken, men bleeding, their wounds testament to the fury of the violence that had just occurred, men broken in ways that would never fully heal, and one man sitting on the floor against the wall, hyperventilating, guns still in his shaking hand. Marty Isipik Delaney, the only one still conscious, the sole survivor. Left alive on purpose, left as a messenger. Bumpy was gone. Vanished like smoke. Disappeared into the Harlem morning as if he had never been there at all. Marty Delaney crawled up those stairs. It took him 20 minutes. Every step was agony. Every movement sent waves of pain through his broken body. Broken ribs. Maybe worse. Internal injuries that he didn't fully understand. He made it to the street as the sun was coming up, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. His shirt was soaked with blood, his own and others. The blood of men he had known, men he had worked with, men he had thought were invincible. He flagged down a cab with blood-soaked money Bronx. He gasped. Arthur Avenue, Dutch Schultz'S headquarters, 8:17 in the morning. Marty stumbled into Dutch's social club on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. Dutch was eating breakfast eggs, toast, coffee, black coffee, no sugar. He was reading the newspaper, looking through the morning edition to see if there was any news worth knowing. He looked up from his paper and saw Marty covered in blood. Every drop of color drained from his face in that instant. The newspaper fell from his hands. Where are the others? His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it that made even his most trusted lieutenants flinch. Marty couldn't speak at first, just shook his head. His lips moved, but nothing came out. The words wouldn't form. The reality was too horrible to speak aloud. Where are my men? Dutch's voice was getting louder. The entire social club fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every ear turned toward Dutch, and the bleeding man standing in front of him. Dead, Marty? Finally whispered. His voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it louder would make it even more true, even more devastating. All of them dead. Dutch stood up slowly. His chair scraped back across the floor, the sound echoing through the social club like an accusation. The entire room went silent, completely silent. Dutchies, lieutenants, his accountants, his bodyguards, everyone stopped. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. What happened? Dutch asked, his voice controlled and even, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had screamed. How is this possible? How could 12 professional killers be taken down by one man in a basement? It defied logic. It defied everything that Dutch understood about violence and power. Marty stared at the floor. He couldn't look Dutch in the eye. The shame was too great. The loss was too devastating. He let me live. To give you a message, the entire room went completely quiet. You could hear the sound of people breathing. Dutch's men waited for the order. They waited for Dutch to unleash hell, to send 50 men to burn Harlem to the ground, to start a war that wouldn't end until one side was completely destroyed, until the streets ran red with blood and Harlem was reduced to ashes. Instead, Dutch picked up a cup of coffee, took a sip. It was cold, but he didn't seem to notice what message. His voice was ice. Marty reached into his jacket. Dutch's men reached for their guns, their hands hovering near their weapons, ready to fire at the first sign of aggression. But Marty pulled out a single playing card, the ace of spades, covered in blood. The card was stained with the blood of 11 men. A playing card that had become a symbol of something beyond violence, beyond money, beyond power. He placed it carefully on the table in front of Dutch. He said to tell you. Marty spoke slowly, each word carrying weight and meaning. Harlem's not for sale. And if you send more men, send more cards. He's collecting a deck. Dutch Schultz stared at that card for a long time. His hand was steady, but something had shifted in his eyes. His entire worldview had shifted in that moment. His men waited. They waited for the order to come. They waited for Dutch to unleash everything he had. They waited for war. Instead, Dutch picked up the card, studied it, looked at the bloodstains, and smiled. Not a happy smile. A resignation smile. The smile of a man who had just understood something fundamental about power and respect. He's got balls. I'll give him that. I'll give him that much. Boss, we can't let this stand. We have to respond. We have to send a message back. Dutch held up his hand, silencing his lieutenant with a gesture. You know what it costs to go to war with someone who's not afraid to die? Someone who's smarter than you? Someone who has an entire neighborhood behind him? He shook his head slowly, as if disappointed by his own men's lack of understanding. It costs everything. It costs more than you can imagine. And for what? Numbers money? There's easier money. There's other territories. There's other opportunities. There are 100 other ways to make money that don't require a war we can't win. He dropped the card in the ashtray on the table, lit a match carefully, set the card on fire, watched it burn. The ace of spades turned black, curled at the edges, the blood and the symbol consumed by flame. We're done in Harlem. Let Bumpy Johnson have it. The decision shocked everyone in that room. Dutch Schultz, the man who had gone to war with Lucky Luciano and lived to tell about it, who had killed his own partners without hesitation when they disappointed him, who never backed down from anyone, backed down to a black man in Harlem, to a man he had never even met. It didn't make sense. But Dutch understood something that his men didn't. He understood power. He understood respect. Bumpy had done something that Dutch respected. He had proven that he was willing to die for his principles. He had proven that he was smarter. He had proven that he understood the rules of violence better than Dutch did. And men like that, you don't fight them. You either kill them, or you leave them alone. And Dutch couldn't kill him. He had tried, and he had failed. And in failing, he had lost. Not just this round, but the entire game. The only option left was to walk away. Years later, in the 1970s, a reporter tracked down one of the Cotton Club's old employees, a man who had been there that night, who had heard the violence, who had seen the aftermath, asked him what really happened that night. The old man smiled, a smile that suggested he knew more than he was saying, that he had carried this secret for decades. You want the truth? Bumpy wasn't alone. What? The reporter leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested. He had 4 guys upstairs the whole time. They locked the basement door from the outside once Dutch's men went down, trapped them in. Bumpy could have killed all 12 if he wanted, could have executed them all and left no survivors. But he let one live on purpose, because Bumpy understood something that Dutch never would. Killing Dutch's men would start a war, but humiliating them? That ends it. That sends a message so powerful that no amount of retaliation can erase it. Whether that's true or legend, nobody knows for certain. The historical record doesn't confirm it. The police files are vague and contradictory. No official report was ever filed. But what we do know with absolute certainty is this. After that night, Dutch Schultz never sent another man to Harlem. Not one. Not ever. The message had been received. The card had been understood. The rules had been rewritten. Bumpy Johnson became the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld. For the next 35 years, he protected that neighborhood like it was his own family. Not with indiscriminate violence, not with cruelty or the arbitrary brutality that characterized so many criminal enterprises, but with strategy, with intelligence, with a code that said you look after your own, that you don't exploit the people in your community, that you stand against injustice even when it comes from the government itself, that you earn respect rather than demand it. The Ace of Spades, Bumpy kept it, framed it, hung it in his office as a reminder of that night, a symbol of what was possible when you understood power better than your enemies did. A reminder that true power came not from guns or violence, but from respect and intelligence and the willingness to sacrifice everything for your principles. A reminder of the moment when Harlem changed forever. Respect isn't given, the framed card seemed to say, it's taken. February 14, 1933. 12 men walked into a basement, 1 walked out, and Harlem was never the same. The numbers game continued to flourish under Bumpy's protection. The money that flowed through it benefited the community. Bumpy used his power not to elevate himself above Harlem, but to lift Harlem up. He became a legend not because of his brutality, but because of his intelligence, his code, his refusal to be broken. His understanding that true power came from protecting your people, from building something that lasted, from earning respect rather than demanding it through fear. And on February 14, 1933, in the darkness of a basement in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson proved that an intelligent man with courage and understanding of violence's true nature was more dangerous than any army of professional killers. He proved that respect was permanent, that fear was temporary, that if you ruled through intelligence and loyalty and code, you became untouchable.